On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We go back to 1932, July of that year actually, and we examine one of the deaths that has remained one of this state's greatest and most enduring mysteries for almost a century. In this edition of Crime Chronicles, we take a look at the death of Z. Smith Reynolds. On July 5th, 1932, late that night, Z. Smith Reynolds, heir to the R.J. Reynolds tobacco fortune, was shot in the head at the Reynolds mansion, the Reynolds family estate. He was taken to Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, where he died several hours later, on July 6th. The question then and now, was the death of Z. Smith Reynolds a case of suicide or was he murdered? That and the life of Z. Smith Reynolds are the subjects of this edition of Crime Chronicles. This story has all the elements of an F. Scott Fitzgerald novel like The Great Gatsby. Wealthy people, perhaps living a very carefree lifestyle, perhaps too carefree in a moral sense for a lot of other people of that day, and particularly during the Great Depression, which set in the late 1920s, early 1930s, while millions of Americans were either starving or out of work, trying very hard just to get by. Here were families like the Reynolds living in, which you can see even today, would be graded as very affluent. Zachary Smith Reynolds, or Z. Smith Reynolds, or just Smith Reynolds, or just Z, was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina on November 5th, 1911. Smith Reynolds was the son of R.J. Reynolds, founder of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, and Catherine Smith Reynolds. The name Reynolds, more specifically R.J. Reynolds, is synonymous with wealth and affluence here in North Carolina, as he was, as most people around the state know, and many people throughout the country for that matter, was the principal founder of one of America's, if not the largest tobacco interest, one of the largest, particularly in his time. Behind me is a symbol of that affluence and that wealth. This is the Reynolds house. It is still open today. It was open around 1917, and it is open to tours and houses a museum for visitors to enter. It also is the place where Z. Smith Reynolds met his death. The room where Z. Smith Reynolds died, and we'll show that in the podcast, stills of the room, is, probably can't see it very well from here behind these trees, but it's in the right-hand corner on the second floor. Now, how did Z. Smith Reynolds die? That's the question. At the time of Smith's birth in 1911, his father was the wealthiest man in North Carolina, and R.J. Reynolds was producing 1/4 of all plug chewing tobacco in the United States. The introduction of the Camel cigarette brand 2 years later spiked the company's profits. In its first year of production, 425 billion Camel cigarettes were sold, becoming the most popular brand in the U.S. by 1918. One story that comes to mind about R.J. Reynolds and how he acquired his fortune in tobacco. Very interesting one, kind of a side note really. But he was a part of a company that was owned, actually overseen by James Duke of Durham, North Carolina. Now, James Duke is not the namesake of Duke University. However, James Duke provided the endowment that allowed for the changing of Duke University to the current name, but he said that Duke University was named after his father. Well, James Duke was sort of over R.J. Reynolds in a way, if you will. Interesting story that R.J. Reynolds' daughter told not long before she died. R.J. Reynolds' principal tobacco product that he profited from at first was Prince Albert Tobacco. And he was doing very well, but he wanted to expand. But James Duke, who was a tobacco magnate himself, at first said that you do anything you want, but lay off cigarettes. Well, somewhere along the line, a change of heart came, and he encouraged R.J. Reynolds to get involved in the cigarette business. He was struggling somewhat financially, and Duke supposedly told R.J. Reynolds, look, why don't you water the stock? And that will artificially inflate the price of your company, but it's not exactly honest and not legal either. Although the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, did not even exist at the time, and the laws and rules overseeing Wall Street were not very well enforced. Well, Reynolds, being an honest man supposedly, and also not wanting to run afoul of the law, refused to water down his stock. Now, sometime along that same time, a circus came to town. A circus came to Winston-Salem, and R.J. Reynolds took his family to see the circus. One of the attractions was a camel. It occurred to R.J. Reynolds, what animal can go the furthest without watering itself, as in thinking about watering the stock? He said, a camel. And so that is how the Camel cigarette brand came to be, in a part of the world that has never seen a camel unless it was in a circus or a zoo. Around 1912, Smith Reynolds' mother, Catherine, began designing a country estate, the future Ronaldo House. The 1,067-acre estate was completed in 1917. Its centerpiece was a 64-room mansion. It included 2 kitchens, 3 dumbwaiters, an elevator, 14 bathrooms, a bowling alley, a full bar, a billiard room, a pipe organ, and a telephone in each room, when very few houses had any telephones. The main house was complemented by formal gardens, vineyards, a golf course, 2 tennis courts, an outdoor swimming pool, and a man-made lake called Lake Catherine with a boathouse. The lake, which no longer exists, was created by damming the nearby Silas Creek. Adjoining the property was the so-called Ronaldo Village, which was primarily used for housing the estate staff and is now a shopping center. The village had its own post office, 2 churches, 2 schools, and a model farm to exhibit and innovate the latest practice in agriculture, horticulture, and livestock production. The Reynolds children attended a school specially built on the estate. Z. Smith Reynolds was raised in affluence, but he also had somewhat of a troubled childhood in a lot of respects. While his parents were good parents in the sense they were good providers, and they were not harsh toward their children, they were also somewhat distant. A lot of the raising in his case was done by hired hands by the Reynolds family. And then Z. Smith Reynolds' life was met with tragedy when, as a child, his father passed away. And before he reached adulthood, his young adulthood for that matter, his mother passed away as well. R.J. Reynolds died on July 29, 1918, from complications due to pancreatic cancer. His will left each of his 4 children a trust that they had limited access to until they reached the age of 28, when they would inherit his entire estate. The headmaster of the Ronaldo School, John Edward Johnston, married the widowed Catherine Reynolds in 1921, 3 years after R.J.'s death. Catherine Reynolds died in 1924 due to complications during childbirth. After Catherine's death, the responsibility of the children's care fell to John Johnston and R.J.'s brother, William Neal Reynolds. Smith Reynolds exhibited signs of acute depression as a teenager, but mental illness carried a stigma, and teen depression was ignored in the 1920s. Psychiatric treatment and depression medications were not an option, even for many wealthy Americans. Smith Reynolds penned several suicide notes and openly talked of killing himself even in high school. This would add to the suspicion that his death was a result of suicide rather than murder. As far as his education went, what kind of student he was, Z. Smith Reynolds was not a very dedicated student. He had the greatest access to education of anybody in North Carolina, or in most parts of the country for that matter, but he didn't take advantage of that. However, he did develop a strong interest in aviation, and that's where it was his real passion. One way to go about examining this case is taking a look at some of the principal people involved, starting with Z. Smith Reynolds himself. At the time of his death, he was 20 years old. Yet, by that time, he had acquired a reputation as one of America's leading aviators, aviation being something new for its time in the 1920s and 1930s. In fact, he got his pilot's license at the age of 16, which was signed off on by none other than one of the Wright brothers, who performed the first successful flight a couple hundred miles from here on the North Carolina coast. Smith Reynolds and his brother Dick developed a fascination with the emerging field of aviation, especially sports aviation, where airplanes were sources of amusement rather than transportation. Aviation was in its infancy, the first successful flight having been launched by the Wright brothers only 2 decades earlier on North Carolina's Outer Banks. Many of Smith's early flights and aviation tricks were performed at the Reynolds Mansion. Smith Reynolds abandoned formal education, opting to devote his time to Reynolds aviation. In May 1929, he attained both his transport license and mechanic's license. At age 17, he was the youngest person in the country to hold a transport pilot's license. Smith became something of a local hero in Winston-Salem and was one of North Carolina's most notable sports aviators during the golden age of aviation. Smith's biggest achievement as an aviator was the longest point-to-point solo circumnavigation at the time, at 17,000 miles over land, lasting from December 1931 to April 1932. The journey began in London and ended in Hong Kong, in between flying over the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Syrian desert, and India. Smith enrolled in New York University's aeronautical engineering program for the fall of 1932 and hired a graduate student to tutor him in mathematics in the interim. Smith would die before entering the program. Another unfortunate aspect of Z. Smith Reynolds' young life was that his first marriage, it came about when he was only about 18 years old, and it was really sort of a forced or arranged marriage between families. He was coerced, if you will, into marrying a woman named Ann Cannon, who by all accounts was a fine person, came from a fine family. But Z. Smith Reynolds simply was not in love with Miss Cannon. By the summer of 1929, Smith Reynolds had begun courting Ann Ludlow Cannon, the granddaughter of industrialist James William Cannon, and an heiress of the Cannon Mills textile fortune based near Charlotte. Ann's father, Joe F. Cannon, insisted that the couple be married. In the early morning of November 16, 1929, he had the couple and himself chauffeured to York, South Carolina, arriving around 2 a.m. to be married in a shotgun wedding. By early 1930, after Ann became pregnant, the pair had separated. In August 1930, she gave birth to a daughter, Ann, who would never get to know her father. About a month into the marriage, Smith's friend Dwight Deere Wyman, heir to the John Deere tractor fortune, visited Winston-Salem. Wyman was a producer of a hit Broadway musical called The Little Show. In April 1930, Smith went to see The Little Show in Baltimore and was dazzled by star Libby Holman. After being introduced, Smith followed up with flowers and notes and followed her. Libby Holman would later state that Smith asked her to marry him right after they first met. She said no because he was so young and his divorce was not final. Libby Holman was a native of Ohio, actually Cincinnati, who came from a fairly well-to-do family in that area. And at a young age, she attained some significant, might say, stardom on Broadway and in theater throughout the country. In fact, she was one of Broadway's leading ladies in the 1920s. Z. Smith Reynolds lived a relatively sheltered life, and he was enamored with Libby Holman. But he was also not really prepared to deal with the type of lifestyle that she led and the people that she associated with. This worldly, sophisticated, devil-may-care Libby Holman was very much the opposite of a young, insecure Smith Reynolds. Friends say that Libby Holman treated Smith Reynolds like an amiable buffoon, but Smith Reynolds persisted and he continued to follow Libby in his plane and also behaving increasingly erratically. They quarreled often, as Smith repeatedly implored Holman to quit her career to marry him, and Holman's flirtatious nature and outgoing show business manner infuriated Smith Reynolds. On at least one occasion, Smith, calling from a Denver hotel room, threatened to kill himself if Holman did not agree to marry him. In June 1931, Smith Reynolds rented a home near Holman's residence in Sands Point, New York. Smith Reynolds continued his histrionics, once driving his Rolls-Royce off a 4-foot retaining wall and into the ocean, and once leading his friends to believe he was going to fly his plane into the ocean. Smith and Ann Reynolds divorced on November 23, 1931. 6 days later, he married Libby Holman in Monroe, Michigan. They met in Hong Kong for their honeymoon and returned to Winston-Salem and the Reynolds house. I'm now standing behind the Reynolds mansion, and behind me, in front of you, is what was the boathouse at the time of Smith Reynolds' death in 1932. Now, I don't know how well you can see, not very well, beside the boathouse. It's abandoned now, as you can probably tell, but all you can see really is this really swampland. There was a lake here, and all that remains of the lake is perhaps what you may be able to see here. Z. Smith Reynolds seemed to be living a life that anybody would envy. He was fabulously wealthy. He could pretty much do as he pleased. There was no real pressure from his parents because they were deceased. The man who was charged with raising Z. Smith Reynolds, his uncle, had since taken the reins off of him. So he had all the freedom, all the money one could want. He lived on an allowance of $50,000 a year. Now that sounds pretty good nowadays for someone who doesn't really have to work for it, but it was very good in the 1930s, particularly when most people were out of work. $50,000 in the 1930s, early 1930s, was about the same as $1.1 million today. So here was a guy living on $1 million a year income and having to not work for it. He didn't stand to inherit the rest of his father's, or his share of his father's estate until sometime later, but he was still living very well. Despite seemingly having it all, Smith Reynolds was a very unhappy young man. One of the things that gave rise to or supported the idea that he committed suicide was the fact that he had threatened to commit suicide so many times before, and that Libby Holman and others had observed that Smith Reynolds was very often extremely depressed. He very often kept his revolver with him, and according to Libby Holman, several times during their marriage, he would raise a weapon to his head and threaten to shoot himself. So there's another chapter in the mysterious death of Smith Reynolds. So the two dates that are at the center of this story are July 5th and July 6th, 1932. Actually, July 5th, day after Independence Day, of course. And while most Americans who were able to work were back at work, not the Reynolds family, they were enjoying, and these are the young Reynolds now, enjoying the benefits, if you will, of the lifestyles of the rich and famous here at the Reynolds house. It was on that day also that Smith Reynolds discovered that his wife, Libby Holman, was pregnant. Was it his child or someone else's? One of the reasons that some people suspect that Libby Holman was carrying someone else's child other than Smith's was because supposedly Smith Reynolds had said to her at one time that he was impotent. Now, did that mean it was something that was permanent or had been going on for a long time, or was it just something perhaps for that day? But that's given rise to suspicions that one of the things that distressed Smith Reynolds on the night of his death was the fact that his wife was pregnant and may have been pregnant by someone else beside himself. The third person in this triangle, Smith Reynolds and Libby Holman, was a friend of Smith Reynolds named Ab Walker. Now, Walker had no particular talent of any sort, except he was part of a wealthy family like the rest of the people around here. But nevertheless, Smith Reynolds hired Ab Walker as a private secretary of some sort. And one of his duties was to help Smith Reynolds make plans for his flights. He had taken a number of flights, both in the United States and other countries as well, and he was planning a round-the-world flight. And Ab Walker's job supposedly was to help him with plans like that. But Ab Walker was a very close confidant of both Smith Reynolds and Libby Holman. The boathouse behind me and what was the lake may have figured prominently in this story as well. The night of Z. Smith Reynolds' death, or the night he was shot, there was considerable partying going on in this young set, and a lot of it was going on right here at this little house behind me and on what was the lake behind me. Smith Reynolds and his friends never needed a good reason to throw a party, but the occasion on July 5th was a 21st birthday party for his childhood friend Charles Gideon Hill Jr. After the party guests had left, the only people in the house aside from Reynolds and Holman were Ab Walker and Blanche Yerka, Holman's friend and acting coach. Ab Walker reported during the inquest that he heard the gunshot while downstairs, and immediately afterwards Holman had run to the balcony and shouted, "Smith's killed himself." Walker said he found Smith bleeding and unconscious upstairs, with a bullet wound to his right temple. With Holman and Yerka's help, Walker brought Smith to the North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem.
What happened after 11 p.m. on July 5th, 1932, at the Reynolds house behind me? A lot of what happened remains a mystery, hence the interest in this case. But around 11:15, one of the people who's the key figure in this case was a man named William Fulcher. Fulcher was one of the employees here, and he was summoned to the Reynolds house. He lived just off the property. He was summoned to the Reynolds house because there was a report that young Smith Reynolds had been shot. Sometime after midnight, Smith Reynolds was admitted to the emergency room at Baptist Hospital here in Winston-Salem. He never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead about 4 hours after his arrival, and that making the day of his death July 6th.
Smith Reynolds was pronounced dead at 5:25 a.m. He died from a shot to his head from a semi-automatic Mauser .32 caliber pistol in the early morning of July 6, 1932.
Now, after Smith's sudden and tragic death, what did his surviving family members have to say? Not Libby Holman, but the Reynolds family. Focus on two people here. First being William Reynolds, who was the uncle who was charged with raising the Reynolds children after their parents' death, and then Smith's older brother, Richard or Dick Reynolds.
William Reynolds, Smith's uncle, was quick to label Smith's death a suicide, but Dick Reynolds thought otherwise and was certain that his brother would not have committed suicide, and stated openly that someone had shot his brother to death.
The immediate assumption and proclamation of the people who were closest to Smith Reynolds at the actual time of his death, that being Libby Holman, Ab Walker, Miss Yerka, they seemed very quick to jump to the conclusion, or tell people at least, that Smith Reynolds had taken his own life, had shot himself. And some of the doctors who examined him at Baptist Hospital, who were not really experienced in the area of forensic pathology, prematurely perhaps, came to that same conclusion. And a number of things happened in the meantime, but it led the solicitor, Mr. Higgins, Carlisle Higgins, to order a coroner's inquest into the death of Smith Reynolds. Interestingly enough, the coroner's inquest did not take place at a courthouse or in some sterile setting. It took place at the Reynolds mansion right here behind me.
The result of the coroner's inquest was that Z. Smith Reynolds had been killed by person or persons unknown. The terminology was tailored to legally exclude Smith as a firer of the gun, ruling out suicide and suggesting murder instead. Libby Holman was suspected of committing the murder, and Ab Walker was accused of being her accomplice. Reporters alleged that Holman had an affair with Walker and that the two murdered Z. Smith Reynolds.
Following the conclusion of the coroner's inquest that Smith Reynolds was killed by persons or persons unknown, two people were indicted for his murder. Those two people were Ab Walker, his best friend, and his wife, Libby Holman. Now, Ab Walker, not long after the indictment, was taken into custody here in Forsyth County, somewhat unceremoniously. Libby Holman was another story. By the time the indictment came down, she was out of state, and it became a story in and of itself as to how she was going to get back to Winston-Salem and be booked and make her first appearance. She wasn't taken back to Winston-Salem to the Forsyth County Jail. Instead, she was very dramatically taken into custody in the neighboring county in Wentworth, North Carolina.
At the time of her indictment, Libby Holman was staying with her family in Ohio. The Holman family knew that a media circus would surround her upon her return to North Carolina to be booked and formally charged. Her father, Albert, also a lawyer, arranged for her to avoid the Winston-Salem media spotlight and the Forsyth County crowd that would show up to gawk at her. So she was delivered to Sheriff L.M. Sheffield at the Rockingham County Jail and formally charged. The Holman family could afford excellent legal counsel for Libby. She was represented at her first appearance in Wentworth by William Graves. Only a small crowd assembled to watch her being led in and out of the local jail.
Well, when she was finally questioned about what happened on the night of Z. Smith Reynolds' death, an interesting twist occurred. Libby Holman developed a very, very unusual case of complete amnesia. Was this claim legitimate or not?
Some mental health experts would suggest that Libby Holman could have been telling the truth, that she really did not remember what happened most of the day on July 5th, several hours before and after Smith was killed, that she has subconsciously repressed the events of that day. By other accounts, as she would say later on, Libby was simply too drunk to remember what happened, and others maintained she was simply lying.
Libby Holman being Jewish was a factor in this case. I would say there was an undercurrent of anti-Semitism attached to this case, but it really wasn't an undercurrent. It was rather overt, which the media could get away with talking about in those days very openly. And one of the things that the prosecutors or the officials involved in this case wanted to avoid was being accused of being involved in a case like the one that happened in Georgia about 20 years prior to this. And that was a case of the lynching of Leo Frank.
Leo Frank was the owner of a pencil factory in Atlanta. In 1913, one of his employees, 13-year-old Mary Fagan, was found murdered in his factory. Leo Frank was charged with her murder amid a tsunami of negative press and a very hostile anti-Semitic atmosphere in the Atlanta area. Frank was convicted and sentenced to death for her murder, and his conviction and sentence were upheld throughout the appellate process. Finally, his death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment by Governor John Slayton. Following the commutation, a mob broke into the Milledgeville, Georgia prison where Frank was incarcerated and transported him to Mary Fagan's hometown of Marietta, where he was publicly lynched. Throughout the ordeal, considerable evidence pointed the finger at Jim Conley, a janitor at the factory, as the real killer. The Leo Frank case generated outrage throughout the country and brought anti-Semitism under a microscope. It was a huge embarrassment for the state of Georgia and reinforced negative stereotypes of Southern justice.
If you read books or watch videos about this, the death of Z. Smith Reynolds, you will find there are sort of two camps of people, but neither one has really came to a firm conclusion, at least one that satisfies me, as to what really happened on July 5th of 1932. There is the argument for murder, and then there are arguments for suicide. What are those arguments? Well, among the arguments for suicide are that Smith Reynolds was known to be very depressed, that he had threatened suicide many times before. For those who argue that Smith Reynolds died by suicide, they also add that he may have been particularly distressed on July 5th for two reasons. One, that was a day he found out that his wife was pregnant, and two, he was put off, to say the least, by his wife's antics of that night. Libby Holman, being a Broadway actress and being this woman that was far from the sheltered life that Smith Reynolds knew growing up, was often very flirtatious, or at least very outgoing, much to the dismay of a person who was raised in a household and a culture where women were supposed to assume sort of a background or secondary role to the man of the house. What about the case for murder? There are a number of arguments in favor of that. One was, this is a bit much to explain in the video, so I'll explain it more in a voiceover, the fact that Libby Holman and Ab Walker's account of what actually happened do not seem to jive with the evidence that was found in that room where Smith Reynolds died.
If Libby Holman and Ab Walker's account of suicide were true, Smith Reynolds was standing over the bed where Libby was lying and shot himself. But the location of the bullet after it exited Smith's body, that being the bedroom wall, would make that account impossible. The trajectory and location of the bullet indicated that Smith Reynolds was lying on the bed when he was shot and was not standing up.
Coupled with the argument about Smith Reynolds not killing himself, but being killed by someone else, that being Ab Walker or Libby Holman, was the fact that Libby Holman, although she had very little experience with firearms, identified the weapon that he used, that she saw him shoot himself with, as a revolver. Now, to most gun novices, like myself included, would she have recognized that what he held in hand was a revolver or just a gun or a pistol? A very compelling argument against the suicide angle concerns angles itself. Most people, if they unfortunately decide to shoot themselves, will either put the gun in their mouth or they may put the gun directly against their temple like this. It turns out that Smith Reynolds died when the gun went through his head, but the bullet exited his left ear, just below the left ear. Now, in order for him to have killed himself, he would have had to hold the gun up like this above his temple, and therefore the bullet would go through his head and exit through his left ear. Some have said that it is very unlikely and even impossible for a person to shoot themselves that way. We don't know how sincere they were when they said this, but Ab Walker and Libby Holman, through their attorneys, claimed that their clients were eager for a trial because that was the only way where they could clear their name. And so they supposedly were looking forward to a trial, and as was the general public.
Carlisle Higgins, the solicitor for Forsyth County, was set to prosecute the case. Judge A.M. Stack was to be the presiding judge. The Holman family initially approached a Jewish lawyer named Sam Leibowitz to represent Libby. Leibowitz was one of the most competent criminal defense attorneys in the country, but he rejected the offer because he was embroiled in another racially charged case. This one involving the Scottsboro boys, 9 young black men facing a death sentence for a rape charge in Alabama. Plus, Leibowitz's affiliation with left-wing organizations might lead jurors to view him as a carpet-bagging radical. Albert Holman enlisted Bennett Polikoff to represent his daughter. The buzz of anti-Semitism was still present, as Polikoff was Jewish as well. But being local, he might have a good rapport with local jurors.
But there would be no trial. As the case was about to come to trial, Mr. Higgins addressed the court and effectively said, "Your Honor, to Judge Stack, we don't think we have enough evidence here to get a conviction, and therefore he requested that the case be nol pros." Now, nol pros basically means that the prosecutor says they refuse to prosecute. It lends itself to the case perhaps being reopened at a future date, but usually it's not. This stunned the courtroom, it stunned the public. Judge Stack, in situations like this, judges are not under obligation to accept a nol pros request from a prosecutor, but they very seldom deny the request because their thinking is, if the prosecutor thinks they can't win the case, why should we bother trying it? And so there was no trial against Libby Holman and Ab Walker. The charges were effectively dismissed. And while that officially cleared their name in the justice system for the most part, it contributed to the mystery of this case, and it led to even more doubts as to whether they were indeed not guilty of this crime. Well, as I sit here having lunch in the Reynolds village, one of the questions that needs to be asked about this case is, what happened to the people involved after this ordeal was done? Another titillating aspect of this case concerns something that Ab Walker said or wrote. About the death of Z. Smith Reynolds, Ab Walker said, "There is a secret about his death which I will take to my grave." And he did.
Ab Walker lived in obscurity until his death in 1954 at age 44. Libby Holman resumed her show business career. Christopher, the son to her brief marriage with Smith Reynolds, died in a mountain climbing accident in 1950 at age 18. Libby married a Canadian Air Force pilot who was killed in an airplane mishap. She also had a relationship with the Oscar-nominated actor Montgomery Clift. Libby Holman became a vocal supporter for civil rights of African Americans, a friend to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and an opponent of American involvement in the Vietnam War. Even though her career thrived, the trauma of Smith's death followed Holman for the rest of her life. She died by suicide June 18, 1971. After her death, a former lover revealed that Libby told him she was so drunk she could not remember what happened the night Z. Smith Reynolds died. This might explain the strange amnesia that seemed to grip Libby that night. Zachary Smith Reynolds is buried in the Salem Cemetery in Winston-Salem. Reynolds' siblings underwent a prolonged fight to receive their share of Smith's estate, after which in 1936 they established a trust in his name that provided for his namesake foundation, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. The foundation's first grant in 1937 went towards the North Carolina State Health Department's activities to treat venereal disease in North Carolinians, with $1.5 million being contributed over the course of a 10-year period. In addition, Winston-Salem's local airport is named in Smith's honor.
Now I'm on the campus of Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, just about a 15-minute walk or so from the Reynolds house. And what does the murder, or the death, I should say, of Z. Smith Reynolds, perhaps a Freudian slip there, what does it have to do with Wake Forest University? Well, it goes something like this. The North Carolina is home to a number of prestigious universities, including North Carolina State University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Appalachian State, Duke University, East Carolina University. For the first 100 or so years of its existence, although it went by different names, Wake Forest College was located in the town of Wake Forest, just north of Raleigh. In the mid-1940s, actually 1946, that was 14 years after the death of Z. Smith Reynolds. The Reynolds family wanted Smith to be remembered for something other than his death. So in the 1930s, they established the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, which is still one of the largest philanthropic organizations in North Carolina. And in 1946, just a year after World War II ended, they made an offer to Wake Forest College to more or less move the entire campus of Wake Forest College from the city of Wake Forest here to Winston-Salem. And that came about, a process, it took several years, but that came about as a result of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. So were it not for the death of Z. Smith Reynolds, would Wake Forest University be in its present state, present location? Of course, we don't know for sure, but there's a connection between Wake Forest University and Z. Smith Reynolds.
Z. Smith Reynolds' daughter Anne from his first marriage was raised primarily by her grandmother, Annie Ludlow Cannon, who kept her granddaughter shielded from the press. As an adult, Anne Reynolds became one of North Carolina's most active philanthropists, supporting hospitals, anti-poverty efforts, and college scholarships for African Americans. Multiple books and films were inspired by the case, including Sing, Sinners Sing in 1933, Reckless with Jean Harlow, released in 1935, Robert Wilder's 1946 novel Written on the Wind, and the 1956 film of the same name with Rock Hudson, Lauren Bacall, and Robert Stack. The Reynolds Building, completed in 1929, still dominates the Winston-Salem skyline.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.